The dusty streets of Redemption Creek buzzed with the usual chaos of a frontier town at sunset. Saloon doors swung open and shut like the heartbeat of the Wild West, releasing bursts of raucous laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional curse word that would make a preacher blush. Inside Murphy's saloon, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of cheap whiskey, creating a haze that seemed to blur the line between reality and the dreams of desperate men. Behind the mahogany bar stood Scarlett O'Malley, a woman whose beauty was as sharp as the knife she kept tucked in her boot. Her emerald eyes held secrets deeper than the mines that dotted the surrounding hills, and her auburn hair caught the lamplight like flames dancing in the wind. She'd learned long ago that in a place where men outnumbered women 10 to 1, survival meant being twice as smart and 3 times as tough as anyone who dared underestimate her. Hey there, friend. Before we dive deeper into Scarlett's story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to our tale in Redemption Creek. At the far end of the bar sat Jake Morrison, a cowboy whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. His weathered hands bore the calluses of a man who'd spent more nights under stars than under roofs, and his steel-grey eyes had seen enough violence to fill a dozen graveyards. Tonight, however, those same eyes were fixed on something far more dangerous than any gunfight he'd ever faced. The captivating woman serving drinks with the confidence of someone who owned the world. For the past hour, Jake had been nursing the same glass of whiskey, his gaze following Scarlett's every movement as she navigated between rowdy miners, card sharks, and drifters. There was something magnetic about the way she carried herself, like a queen ruling over her domain of broken dreams and liquid courage. Every gesture was calculated, every smile a weapon more lethal than the Colt 45 strapped to his hip. Scarlett had noticed his stare from the moment he'd walked through those swinging doors. In her 3 years working at Murphy's, she'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read men, their intentions, their desperation, their capacity for both violence and tenderness. Most cowboys who wandered into her saloon were easy to categorize: the lonely ones seeking comfort, the angry ones looking for a fight, or the greedy ones chasing fool's gold. But Jake Morrison was different. His stare wasn't predatory or crude. It was intense, almost reverent, as if he were trying to memorize every detail of her face. The tension in the room was palpable, like the moment before a summer storm breaks over the prairie. Other patrons had begun to notice the silent standoff between the mysterious cowboy and the sharp-tongued barmaid. Conversations grew quieter, card games slowed, and even old Murphy himself paused in his eternal task of polishing glasses to watch the drama unfold. Finally, Scarlett had had enough. She set down the bottle of whiskey she'd been pouring, placed both hands on the bar, and fixed Jake with a stare that could have melted steel. The saloon fell silent, except for the distant sound of a harmonica playing somewhere in the back room. When she spoke, her voice carried across the room like a gunshot in the night. "You keep staring like I'm gonna undress myself for free." "Cowboy," she said, her Irish accent adding a musical lilt to the cutting words. "This ain't that kind of saloon." The silence that followed was deafening. Every man in the room held his breath, waiting to see how the infamous Jake Morrison would respond to such a bold challenge. In the Wild West, words like those could start a war or end a life, depending on the pride of the man they were aimed at. But Jake Morrison surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of reaching for his gun or storming out in anger, he threw back his head and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the saloon. It was the kind of laugh that spoke of a man who'd found something precious in the most unexpected place. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I wouldn't dream of asking for anything you weren't willing to give freely. I was just admiring the finest piece of artwork this side of the Mississippi." Scarlett felt her cheeks flush despite herself. She'd expected anger, maybe violence, certainly not this smooth-talking charm that seemed to disarm her usual defenses. There was something in his eyes, a depth that spoke of pain and loss, but also of hope that refused to die despite everything the frontier had thrown at him. The other patrons began to murmur among themselves, some disappointed that blood wouldn't be spilled, others impressed by the cowboy's unexpected gallantry. The tension in the room shifted from anticipation of violence to something far more intriguing, the electric charge that passes between two people who recognize something kindred in each other's souls. Scarlett found herself studying Jake's face more carefully now, noting the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the way his hands remained steady despite the obvious tension in his shoulders, and the fact that his gun, while present, had never moved toward its holster during their exchange. This was a man who knew violence intimately, but chose his battles carefully. "Artwork, is it?" she replied, her tone softening just enough to let him know his words had found their mark. "Well, cowboy, this particular piece comes with a price tag that most men in these parts can't afford." Jake leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "And what might that price be, Miss O'Malley?" "Scarlett O'Malley." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "The price is respect, honesty, and the understanding that I'm nobody's property to be won or lost in a card game." The cowboy nodded slowly, as if he were sealing a sacred pact. "Jake Morrison, at your service, Miss O'Malley, and I reckon those are terms any decent man should be willing to meet without question." As the evening wore on, the saloon gradually returned to its normal rhythm of drinking, gambling, and storytelling. But something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. Jake remained at his spot at the bar, no longer staring but engaging Scarlett in conversation whenever her duties allowed. They spoke of small things at first: the weather, the quality of the whiskey, the characters who frequented the establishment, but underneath the surface pleasantries, both could sense the deeper currents of attraction and possibility. Scarlett learned that Jake had been a cattle driver before a stampede killed his horse and left him stranded in Redemption Creek. He'd been working odd jobs around town for the past month, trying to earn enough money to buy a new mount and continue his journey west. But as the days passed, he found himself less eager to leave, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Jake discovered that Scarlett had come to Redemption Creek 3 years ago, fleeing a life back east that she refused to discuss in detail. She'd started working at Murphy's out of necessity, but had gradually carved out a position of respect and relative safety in a world that offered precious little of either to women on their own. She had dreams of someday opening her own establishment, a place where travelers could find good food, clean beds, and honest conversation without the constant threat of violence that plagued most frontier towns. As the night deepened and the crowd began to thin, their conversations grew more personal. Jake spoke of the loneliness of the trail, the way the vast emptiness of the prairie could make a man feel like the last person on earth. Scarlett shared her fears about the future, her determination to build something lasting in a world that seemed designed to tear everything down. There was an honesty between them that neither had experienced in years, a recognition that they were both survivors who had learned to navigate a harsh world without losing their essential humanity. In Jake's weathered face, Scarlett saw strength tempered by kindness. In Scarlett's fierce independence, Jake glimpsed the possibility of a partnership built on mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. The clock above the bar chimed midnight, and Murphy began making his rounds, politely but firmly encouraging the remaining patrons to settle their tabs and head home. Jake finished his whiskey and stood, placing a silver dollar on the bar, more than enough to cover his drinks and a generous tip besides. "Miss O'Malley," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "it's been a pleasure making your acquaintance. I hope our paths cross again soon." Scarlett felt an unexpected pang of disappointment as she watched him prepare to leave. "Mr. Morrison," she called out, causing him to pause at the door. "Murphy serves breakfast starting at dawn. The coffee's strong and the eggs are fresh." Jake's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I'll keep that in mind, ma'am. I surely will." As the saloon doors swung shut behind him, Scarlett found herself staring at the empty space where he'd stood, already counting the hours until morning. For the first time in 3 years, she was looking forward to tomorrow with something more than mere resignation. Outside, Jake paused on the wooden sidewalk, breathing in the cool night air and marveling at the unexpected turn his evening had taken. He'd come to Murphy's looking for nothing more than a drink and perhaps some human company. Instead, he'd found something he'd thought was lost to him forever: hope. The next morning arrived with the golden light of dawn, painting the dusty streets of Redemption Creek in shades of amber and rose. Jake had spent a restless night in his small room above the general store, his mind replaying every word of his conversation with Scarlett O'Malley. He'd known beautiful women before, but there was something about her that went beyond mere physical attraction. She possessed a fire that reminded him of everything he'd once believed about the possibility of building something meaningful in this untamed land. True to his word, Jake appeared at Murphy's saloon just as the first rays of sunlight began streaming through the windows. The establishment looked different in the morning light, less mysterious, more welcoming. The tables that had hosted heated poker games the night before now bore checkered tablecloths and simple place settings. The air smelled of coffee and bacon instead of whiskey and tobacco. Scarlett emerged from the kitchen carrying a steaming pot of coffee, her hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her saloon dress replaced by a simple blue calico that somehow made her even more beautiful than she'd been the night before. When she saw Jake standing in the doorway, her face lit up with a smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Well, I'll be," she said, setting the coffee pot on the nearest table. "A man of his word. That's rarer than gold in these parts." Jake removed his hat and took a seat at the table she indicated. "My mother raised me to keep my promises, Miss O'Malley, even the small ones." As Scarlett poured his coffee, Jake caught a whiff of her perfume, something light and floral that seemed completely at odds with the rough frontier setting. It was a reminder that beneath her tough exterior, she was still very much a lady, carrying pieces of a more civilized world with her into this harsh landscape. "Tell me about your mother," Scarlett said, settling into the chair across from him with her own cup of coffee. "What was she like?" Jake's expression grew soft with memory. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew. Raised 5 boys on a farm in Missouri after my father died in the war. Never complained, never gave up, even when the crops failed or the bank threatened to foreclose. She used to say that a person's character isn't measured by what they do when life is easy, but by how they respond when everything falls apart." Scarlett nodded thoughtfully. "Sounds like a wise woman. I think she and my grandmother would have gotten along well. Gran always said that the measure of a person isn't in what they have, but in what they're willing to sacrifice for others." They talked through breakfast, sharing stories of their families, their dreams, and the paths that had led them to this moment in this place. Jake learned that Scarlett had been educated at a finishing school back east, that she could speak 3 languages and play piano, skills that seemed almost absurd in the context of frontier life, but which explained the grace and intelligence that set her apart from other women he'd known. Scarlett discovered that Jake had once owned a small ranch with his brother, that they'd lost everything in a drought that lasted 3 years, and that his brother had died trying to drive their remaining cattle to market. The pain in his eyes when he spoke of it made her want to reach across the table and take his hand. But she restrained herself, sensing that he was a man who needed to maintain his dignity even in moments of vulnerability. As the morning progressed, other early risers began filtering into the saloon for breakfast. Murphy emerged from his private quarters, nodding approvingly at the sight of his star employee entertaining a paying customer. The old Irishman had developed a protective fondness for Scarlett over the years, and he'd been watching Jake Morrison carefully since the Cowboy's arrival in town. "Morrison," Murphy called out, approaching their table with a fresh pot of coffee. "Word around town is you're handy with horses." Jake looked up, surprised by the interruption. "I've worked with them most of my life, yes, sir." "Got a problem you might be able to help with," Murphy continued. "Doc Henderson's mare has been acting up something fierce. Won't let anyone near her, and the doc needs to make his rounds. You interested in taking a look?" Scarlett watched Jake's face carefully as he considered the offer. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the opportunity against whatever plans he might have had for the day. "I'd be happy to take a look," Jake said finally. "No charge if I can't help." Murphy grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "Fair enough. Doc's place is 2 blocks down. Can't miss it. Got a sign out front." As Murphy walked away, Scarlett leaned forward slightly. "That was kind of you. Doc Henderson's a good man. Delivered half the babies in this town and never asked for payment from folks who couldn't afford it." Jake shrugged, but she could see the pleasure her approval brought him. "Like I said, my mother raised me right." After breakfast, Scarlett walked with Jake to Doc Henderson's place, ostensibly to introduce him, but really because she wasn't ready for their time together to end. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. As they walked, their hands occasionally brushed, sending small electric shocks through both of them. Doc Henderson turned out to be a kindly man in his 60s, with gentle eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime spent healing rather than hurting. His mare, a beautiful chestnut named Rosie, was indeed acting aggressively, rearing and striking whenever anyone approached her stall. Jake studied the horse for several minutes, noting the way she favored her left front hoof and the slight swelling around her fetlock. "She's in pain," he said quietly. "Probably stepped on something sharp. The aggression is just her way of protecting herself." Working slowly and speaking in low, soothing tones, Jake managed to get close enough to examine Rosie's hoof. Sure enough, he found a sharp stone wedged deep in the frog. Using tools borrowed from the doc's medical bag, he carefully extracted the stone and cleaned the wound. "She'll need to be kept quiet for a few days," he told Doc Henderson. "Clean the wound twice daily with warm salt water, and she should be fine." The transformation in the mare was immediate. No longer in pain, she nuzzled Jake's shoulder gratefully, her aggressive behavior completely gone. Doc Henderson was amazed, and Scarlett found herself looking at Jake with new respect. "Son," the doc said, pressing a $5 gold piece into Jake's hand, "that's the finest piece of horse doctoring I've seen in 20 years. If you ever decide to settle down in Redemption Creek, I could use a partner who understands animals the way you do." As they walked back toward the saloon, Scarlett was unusually quiet. Finally, Jake couldn't stand the silence any longer. "Penny for your thoughts, Miss O'Malley." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes serious. "I was thinking about what Doc Henderson said, about settling down. Is that something you've ever considered?" Jake felt his heart begin to race. The question seemed loaded with possibilities, but he didn't want to read more into it than she intended. "I've thought about it," he said carefully, "but settling down requires more than just wanting to. It requires having something worth staying for." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, both of them understood that they were no longer talking about abstract possibilities. They were talking about each other, about the connection that had sparked between them in the space of less than 24 hours. "Jake," Scarlett began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with her words. "I need you to understand something about me. I'm not like other women you might have known. I've made my own way in the world, and I won't give up my independence for any man, no matter how I might feel about him." Jake nodded slowly. "I wouldn't ask you to. A woman like you shouldn't be caged, Scarlett. She should be cherished for exactly who she is." The use of her first name sent a thrill through her that she tried to hide. "And what about you? What do you want from life, Jake Morrison?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "I want to build something that lasts. I want to wake up every morning with purpose, knowing that what I do matters to someone other than myself. I want—" He paused, then took a deep breath. I want to find someone who sees the world the way I do, who believes that even in a place as hard as this, good people can create something beautiful together. Scarlett felt her breath catch in her throat. His words painted a picture of the life she'd dreamed of but never dared hope for. A partnership of equals, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. That sounds like a fine life, she said softly. A life worth fighting for. They had reached the saloon, but neither seemed eager to go inside. The morning was giving way to afternoon, and soon Scarlett would need to begin preparing for the evening crowd. But for now, they stood together on the wooden sidewalk, two people who had found something unexpected and precious in each other. "Scarlett," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know we've only just met, but I feel like I've been looking for you my whole life without knowing it." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know," she whispered. "I feel it too." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Redemption Creek as Jake and Scarlett stood outside Murphy's saloon, their hands clasped together in a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Around them, the town continued its daily rhythm, merchants hawking their wares, children playing in the dusty streets, and the constant sound of hammers as new buildings rose to meet the demands of a growing population. But for Jake and Scarlett, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and the electric connection that seemed to pulse between their joined hands. Neither wanted to be the first to break the spell, to return to the practical concerns of daily life that would inevitably intrude on this perfect moment. It was the sound of approaching hoofbeats that finally shattered their reverie. A lone rider was thundering down the main street, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, dust billowing behind them like a brown cloud. As he drew closer, Jake recognized him as Tommy Sullivan, one of the younger cowboys who worked for the Circle K ranch outside of town. Tommy pulled his horse to a sliding stop in front of the saloon, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Jake! Jake Morrison!" he called out, swinging down from his saddle with practiced ease. "Thank God you're here. We need your help, and we need it now." Jake reluctantly released Scarlett's hand and stepped forward. "What's the trouble, Tommy?" "It's the Blackwood gang," Tommy said, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. "They hit the bank in Silver Falls this morning, killed 2 people, and now they're heading this way. Sheriff's out of town, and we got word they plan to rob our bank before sundown." Scarlett felt her blood run cold. The Blackwood gang was notorious throughout the territory, a group of ruthless outlaws led by a man named Silas Blackwood, who was said to have no conscience and no mercy. They'd been terrorizing small towns for months, always staying one step ahead of the law. "How many of them?" Jake asked, his demeanor shifting instantly from romantic suitor to seasoned gunfighter. 6, maybe 7. They're armed to the teeth and riding hard. Should be here within the hour. Jake's mind raced, calculating odds and possibilities. Redemption Creek had no sheriff, no organized law enforcement of any kind. The nearest federal marshal was 3 days' ride away. If the Blackwood gang was really coming, the town's only hope lay in the handful of men brave enough and skilled enough to stand against them. "Tommy, ride to every ranch and homestead within 10 miles, Jake ordered. "Tell every man who can handle a gun to get to town as fast as possible. We'll make our stand at the bank." As Tommy remounted and spurred his horse back into motion, Jake turned to Scarlett. The look in his eyes was one she'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and utterly without fear. This was Jake Morrison, the gunfighter, the man whose reputation had preceded him to Redemption Creek. "You need to get somewhere safe," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Murphy's has a root cellar, doesn't it? Take the other women and children and stay there until this is over." Scarlett's chin came up defiantly. "I'm not hiding in any cellar while good men risk their lives to protect this town. I can handle a gun as well as most men, and better than some." Jake started to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped him. He'd already learned that Scarlett O'Malley was not a woman to be ordered around. and he suspected that trying to force her to hide would only waste precious time they didn't have. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay close to me, and you do exactly what I tell you when the shooting starts." "Agreed?" She nodded, already moving toward the saloon. "I need to get my rifle and warn Murphy. He'll want to protect his establishment." As Scarlett disappeared through the swinging doors, Jake began taking stock of their situation. Redemption Creek's main street was wide and dusty, with buildings on both sides that could provide cover for defenders. The bank sat at the far end of the street, a solid brick structure that would be difficult to assault directly. If they could position men in the right places, they might be able to create a crossfire that would discourage the outlaws from pressing their attack. Within minutes, word of the impending raid had spread throughout the town. Men emerged from shops and saloons carrying rifles and shotguns, their faces grim but determined. Jake was surprised to see Doc Henderson among them, an old army Colt strapped to his hip. "Doc, you should be getting the women and children to safety," Jake said. The older man shook his head. "I've seen what men like Blackwood do to towns that don't fight back. Sometimes a man has to take a stand, regardless of the consequences." Murphy appeared with a double-barreled shotgun and a bandolier of shells across his chest. "This is my town too, Morrison. I'll not be hiding while others fight for it." By the time Tommy returned with reinforcements from the surrounding ranches, Jake had assembled a force of nearly 20 men. It wasn't much against the Blackwood gang's reputation, but it was more than most towns could muster on short notice. Jake positioned his men carefully, placing the best shots in the upper windows of buildings along the main street, while others took cover behind water troughs, hitching posts, and the corners of buildings. He kept Scarlett close to him, positioned behind the thick wooden counter of the general store, where she would have both protection and a clear field of fire. The waiting was the hardest part. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, tension mounted throughout the town. Children had been hustled to safety, and the streets that had been bustling with activity just hours before now lay empty and silent, like a stage set waiting for the final act of a deadly drama. It was Scarlett who spotted them first, a dust cloud on the eastern horizon that gradually resolved into 7 riders moving at a steady lope toward town. Even at a distance, there was something menacing about the way they rode, spread out in a line like wolves approaching a flock of sheep. "Here they come," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that Jake could see in her eyes. Jake checked his weapons one final time, his Colt .45 in its holster, a Winchester rifle in his hands, and a backup pistol tucked into his belt. Around the town, he could hear the subtle sounds of other men making their final preparations, the soft click of hammers being cocked, the whisper of metal against leather as guns were drawn and checked. The Blackwood gang rode into Redemption Creek like they owned it, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. Silas Blackwood himself was easy to identify, a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a black beard that gave him an almost demonic appearance. He wore his guns low on his hips, and there was something in his posture that spoke of absolute confidence in his ability to take whatever he wanted. The outlaws pulled up in front of the bank, and Blackwood dismounted with casual arrogance. He looked around the seemingly empty street and smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "Folks of Redemption Creek," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We've come for the contents of your bank. Nobody needs to get hurt if you just stay out of our way." Jake waited until Blackwood and 2 of his men had started toward the bank's front door before standing up behind his cover. "That's far enough, Blackwood," he shouted. "This town's under protection. Turn around and ride out, and nobody gets hurt." Blackwood stopped and turned, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Well, well, Jake Morrison, I heard you might be in these parts. Thought you'd learned your lesson about interfering in other people's business." "Some lessons don't take," Jake replied, his rifle trained on the outlaw leader's chest. "Last chance, Silas. Ride out now." Blackwood's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. I don't think so, Morrison. See, I've got 6 men with me, and you've got, what? A handful of shopkeepers and farmers. This should be over quick. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of rifle bolts being worked all along the main street. Suddenly, the empty town revealed itself to be very much occupied, with gun barrels protruding from windows, doorways, and every available piece of cover. Blackwood's confident expression faltered slightly as he realized he'd ridden into a trap. "Well," he said, his hand now resting openly on his gun butt, "I guess we do this the hard way." What happened next occurred with the lightning speed that characterized all gunfights in the Old West. Blackwood went for his gun, and Jake's rifle barked in response. The outlaw leader spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, as the street erupted in a thunderous exchange of gunfire. Scarlett's rifle spoke from beside Jake, and one of the mounted outlaws tumbled from his saddle. All around them, the defenders of Redemption Creek poured lead into the gang, their weeks of preparation and Jake's tactical positioning paying off in devastating fashion. The battle was fierce but brief. Caught in a crossfire with no cover, the Blackwood gang found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. Within minutes, 3 of the outlaws lay dead in the street. 2 more were wounded and surrendering, and the remaining 2 were spurring their horses out of town as fast as they could ride. Silas Blackwood himself lay in the dust, his shoulder shattered by Jake's bullet, his reign of terror finally at an end. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, the people of Redemption Creek began to emerge from their hiding places, hardly able to believe that they had actually won. Jake stood slowly, his rifle still ready, scanning the street for any sign of continued threat. When he was satisfied that the danger had passed, he turned to Scarlett, who was reloading her rifle with practiced efficiency. "You all right?" he asked, noting the slight tremor in her hands that she was trying to hide. She nodded, though her face was pale. "I'm fine. I've never shot at a person before, but when I saw him aiming at you—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Jake reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands, setting it aside before pulling her into his arms. She came willingly, burying her face against his chest as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You were brave, Scarlett. Braver than you needed to be." Around them, the town was coming back to life. Doc Henderson was already tending to the wounded outlaws, his medical oath compelling him to treat even those who had come to harm his community. Murphy was organizing a group to clean up the street, while others were checking on the bank to make sure no damage had been done. Tommy Sullivan approached them, his young face flushed with excitement and admiration. "Jake, that was the finest piece of fighting I've ever seen. The way you positioned everyone, the way you waited for just the right moment. You saved this town." Jake shook his head. "We all saved this town. Tommy, every man who stood up and fought saved this town." As the afternoon wore on and the immediate crisis passed, Jake found himself thinking about Doc Henderson's earlier offer of partnership. The old physician had been right. Redemption Creek could use a man with Jake's skills, not just as a gunfighter, but as someone who understood the delicate balance between civilization and the wild frontier. But more than that, Jake realized he'd found something in this dusty little town that he'd been searching for his entire adult life. He'd found a place where he could make a difference, where his skills and experience could be used to protect rather than destroy. And he'd found a woman who could stand beside him as an equal partner in building something lasting and meaningful. As the sun began to set over Redemption Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake and Scarlett stood together outside Murphy's saloon, watching the town return to normal. The crisis had passed, but both of them understood that their lives had been fundamentally changed by the events of the day. "So," Scarlett said, her voice soft in the gathering twilight, "what happens now?" Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "Now we decide what kind of future we want to build together. If you'll have me, that is." She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Morrison?" "I'm asking you to be my partner," he replied, "in every sense of the word, to help me build something good and lasting in this place, to stand with me against whatever challenges come our way." Scarlett felt her heart swell with a happiness she'd never dared hope for. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, I'll stand with you." As they kissed for the first time, the people of Redemption Creek went about their evening routines, secure in the knowledge that their town was protected by two people who had found in each other the strength to face whatever the frontier might throw at them. The Wild West was still wild, but in this small corner of it, love had triumphed over violence and hope had conquered fear. The wedding of Jake Morrison and Scarlett O'Malley took place 3 weeks later in the newly built church at the center of Redemption Creek. The entire town turned out for the celebration, grateful to the couple who had helped save their community and eager to welcome them as permanent residents. Doc Henderson performed the ceremony, having been ordained as a minister in his younger days, and Murphy provided the reception at his saloon, which had been decorated with wildflowers and white ribbons for the occasion. It was a simple affair by Eastern standards, but it was filled with genuine warmth and affection from people who had come to love and respect the bride and groom. As Jake and Scarlett exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other through whatever trials the frontier might bring, both of them thought back to that first night when a simple comment about staring had sparked something that would change their lives forever. Sometimes, they reflected, the most important moments in life begin with the most unexpected encounters. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued into the night, Jake and Scarlett slipped away for a few moments of privacy. They stood together on the porch of their new home, a small house that Jake had built with help from the grateful townspeople, looking out over the town they had helped to save and would continue to protect. "Do you ever regret it?" Scarlett asked, her hand resting in the crook of Jake's arm. "Giving up the wandering life to settle down here?" Jake smiled and pulled her closer. "The only thing I regret is all the years I spent looking for something I didn't know I'd lost. I was searching for a home, Scarlett, and I found it in you." She leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his presence and marveling at how much her life had changed in such a short time. "I love you, Jake Morrison, and I love you." "Scarlett Morrison," he replied, savoring the sound of her new name. As they stood together in the moonlight, listening to the sounds of celebration drifting from the saloon and the gentle night sounds of the prairie beyond, both of them knew that they had found something rare and precious, a love that could withstand the harsh realities of frontier life. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams, and a future filled with infinite possibilities. The Wild West would continue to be wild, with all its dangers and uncertainties, but Jake and Scarlett Morrison would face it together, two hearts united in purpose, two souls who had found their home in each other and in the dusty little town of Redemption Creek. And in the years to come, their love story would become part of the town's legend, a reminder that even in the hardest of times and the roughest of places, love could still triumph, hope could still flourish, and two people could still build something beautiful together. Their story had begun with a challenge thrown across a crowded saloon, but it would continue for the rest of their lives as a testament to the power of love, to transform not just individual hearts, but entire communities. In Redemption Creek, they had found their redemption, and in each other they had found their forever.